Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Steve Orme here, the Midlands editor of the British Theatre Guide. The Nottinghamshire-based company New Perspectives is known for making new work for a wide range of audiences and spaces. Obviously, at the moment, the company's touring work has been put on hold. So, it's been working on a 10-part audio series written by David Rudkin. The dramatist and screenwriter has come up with what's called a sequence of journeys into haunted landscapes for voices and sound. Jack McNamara, the artistic director of New Perspectives, explained that the company's had a long association with the 83-year-old writer.
We did a play of his called The Love Song of Alfred J. Hitchcock back when I first joined New Perspectives 8 years ago, and it was a very strange and a kind of amazing biopic of Alfred Hitchcock that we opened at Leicester Curve, and it travelled actually to New York. It went for a month off Broadway in New York, and he's a very, very unique writer. He writes some incredible quality and density of language, and while we were in New York actually doing that other show, he told me about 10 pieces of work he had written, uncommissioned, just from his own heart, that gave a voice to very remote locations across the UK. So I was intrigued because obviously we're a touring company, we're very committed to the rural world, everything about the project sounded interesting. So he got hold of a copy. It was it's a huge pile of scripts. They weren't even scripts actually, they were written out more like short stories, more in prose form. And I read them, and all 10 of them were just mini masterpieces. They were just unbelievable pieces of writing. So I felt that I had to do something with them at some point. This was 2014, I think. So it's taken a long time to work out exactly what the right avenue is for them. So over the years we've read them on occasion in the sites that they're based. So one of them is based in Orme. It tells the story of the plague outbreak, and we read that live with a kind of musical presence in Orme Church, to the residents of the village. In other instances, we did occasional readings of them, at the BFI Film Centre in London. I'm trying to think where else now. We just have they popped up in various ways. But still, they were audio pieces, they were intended to go straight into your ears. So I always knew we had to somehow capture them on audio. So eventually, the Space, the organisation who focus on digital work, were very kind to give us a commission to finally record them all and have them. And it was only then that it was introduced to me, the idea of them possibly being a podcast, because that was a totally new medium for me. I didn't even listen to podcasts, to be honest. So I kind of, first of all, was a bit sceptical. But then, having learnt about it, what's so appropriate about the podcast medium for this project is that it seems to be one of the only mediums where you can talk in a very solitary way to a person and really speak in their ear, because a lot of podcasts are experienced alone through headphones, whereas radio obviously has a slightly different status now. It's a lot more communal, it's a lot more passive. So I started to realise it was strange, because Rudkin is a writer now in his mid-80s, and he's written for the stage and for radio and for opera, but the idea of an older writer like that funneling these works down into such a contemporary medium was suddenly really exciting.
Yeah, you've obviously dealt with David Rudkin quite a lot. Do you think, as a playwright, he gets the credit he deserves?
No, not at all. I mean, he's got huge supporters and following, and he's developed a kind of legendary status, I guess. Rufus Norris, who runs the National Theatre, one of his early breakthroughs was doing Rudkin's play A Four-Night Come. And, whenever I do a project like PlacePrints, there's all kinds of famous actors like Juliet, Stevenson, Toby Jones, who want to be part of it. So he has a huge amount of respect within the industry. But no, I don't think he's had the status he deserves at all. Partly because his ambition has been so wide and so kind of uncontained in a way that it's probably been a bit scary to a lot of programmers and producers. He has a play called Ashes, which is a four-hander, which has been done quite extensively. But other than that, his plays are huge, big in their ideas and big in the resources they need to put them on. So I think people have been scared of him, really. And I also think that, the reality is that playwrights need to be taken care of, I think, and I don't say that in a patronizing way. I just mean it's the one art form where you, if you don't have machinery behind you, there's very little you can do. It's not like a musician who can play their music, whatever, in a pub if they need to, or a novelist who can just sit and write and write and write. I think for a playwright, you need to have the machinery of producing organizations backing you and pushing you and getting your stuff out there. I hope that these pieces also poke people a bit, people who run places, to rethink about people like Rudkin and other visionary artists who have more to say, really.
Yeah, you've got the likes of Michael Pennington, Toby Jones, Juliet, Stevenson recording these audio plays. Was it difficult to get hold of them, or were they fans of Rudkin's work anyway?
They were all big fans, so it wasn't particularly hard. Toby Jones was interesting because he didn't know Rudkin personally, but his father, both his parents are actors, and his father had played a key role in Rudkin's first play, A Four-Night Come, and his mother had played a key role in David's most famous movie, which is called Penda's Fen. So it was a kind of lovely little, completion of a triangle in a way, that Toby, after having both his folks in major Rudkin works, could take part in this one. But in terms of everybody else, it's just like all these things, it's about finding people at the right time. So Michael Pennington was at the Royal in Derngate playing King Lear, and I kind of thought, oh, okay, because I knew they had a history together, Rudkin and him. So I just kind of dropped his agent a note going, look, he's in Northampton and I'm just down the road. Can we zip over and do this recording? I think it's getting people like that is, it's a time and place thing, isn't it? It's about just having the right timing. And then Juliet, Stevenson and people like that, were, again, very busy people, but we did a performance at the Print Room in London, and I just managed to kind of grab an inch of her time to come over. And she was really enthusiastic to do so, and, rehearsed it with me in a really brilliant, detailed way, and then her performance that's on the podcast now, called Grimm's Ditch, was a single take live performance that she did in front of the audience, and it's amazing. I mean, it is truly amazing, that she could do that with so little preparation.
Yeah, you mentioned one of the plays, Here We Stay, set in Derbyshire. People in the village of Orme in 1665, when they went into self-quarantine to prevent the plague spreading. Really, neither David nor yourself could have realised how poignant that will become in 2020.
No, absolutely. And, like you say, it was written entirely without any sense of this being a possibility for us. I remember an audience member coming up to us during the performance. We did, as I said to you, we did a live performance in Orme 5 years ago, and an audience member came up to us, saying he was very moved and saying, this play is reminding me of the Ebola crisis which has recently happened. But that, I remember him saying that, and I remember thinking, being struck by the parallel, but that was as close as he could bring his, experience of the play to anything happening that was contemporary. And obviously the Ebola crisis was a serious crisis, but it was so removed from life in the UK that I don't think anybody sat in that theatre, or church rather, and listening to that play, thinking that this was something that was going to present itself in our lives. So no, absolutely, it was written completely separate to that, but as things were unfolding here in the UK and around the world, David, I was in the midst of editing these podcasts, and David would just drop me the occasional message going, isn't this all feeling a little bit like that play? So, and we kind of laughed it off. But then by the time the podcast was ready, I remember I got into a phase where I started sticking them on my headphones and going for like a bike ride, because I was getting it's a bit like editing a film, your eyes become a bit bleary. So I decided I needed to do my last round of editing by kind of putting them up in my ears and kind of going off into the landscape and just, hearing them that way. And I remember biking around with Here We Stay in my ears, looking around at all these sort of socially distanced couples, looking at these empty streets, and the resonance of what was being spoken about was really quite frightening and terrifying. The voice of the plague narrates Here We Stay. So, we're so used to hearing about all what's going on through the victims and through the politicians who are trying to give us policies to live through this and, all this sort of thing. But the fact that Here We Stay is narrated by the plague is just stunning. And incredible, really, because he actually digs into the psychology of how a microorganism like that may express itself and may think about what it's doing. But yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing to hear in this time.
If we can go back to the love song of Alfred J. Hitchcock, you actually directed that, didn't you? So what was that like, working very closely with David Rudkin?
Well, I directed these podcasts as well, but I did that it's quite remote, I guess, from working with the writer. Directing Love Song of Alfred J. Hitchcock, it was great working with him. I mean, in a way, he didn't overbear on the rehearsal process too much, and he had a very generous policy, which was, he said, if you cut anything, just don't tell me. And if I'm watching a run and my ear or my mind picks up on something that feels left out, we'll talk about it. But he would prefer that, and I think it's a really good idea, because obviously you go up to a writer and say, hey, look, we want to cut this speech in half. That writer has so many connections to that speech, it's unlikely they're going to feel particularly comfortable. So I thought that was a really good approach, really. Just get on with what you have to do, and we can talk about any omissions, once the thing starts running. So it was great, and it was very hard, though. He doesn't make it easy for actors or directors, because there's so much attention required given to the language and to the detail of the language, the imagery of the language. So I've often thought he writes very directly for the imagination. He's not a showy writer. He's a kind of deep set writer. So the actors on stage can't just lose themselves in the action of a scene. They have to kind of dig themselves into the kind of contours of imagination that David's created. And as a director, I guess it's about managing that and also making the actors on stage alive and engaging. Do you see what I mean? So it was a very, really challenging to do. And I think the play was a success in one way. I thought it was an absolutely stunning piece of writing with an incredible, mainly central performance by an actor called Martin Miller, who just took it and went miles with it. But, it asked a lot of its audience. And when we went to New York with it, we got a pretty much split down the middle rave reviews and absolutely hateful reviews. But, David's been an innovator for a long time, so he's quite used to that.
As a company, New Perspectives tours what you've described as ambitious and original theatre. So presumably Rudkin's work really fits into that category.
Yeah, he's ambitious in as much as, the worlds that he opens up and that he evokes with writing are huge, And, he doesn't do the kind of bite-sized, easy digestible thing. He just doesn't, it's not really in his makeup. So Here We Stay, for example, is a 70-minute piece. It's big, I know the podcasts like to be sort of 21 minutes and nice and jazzy and skipping along, but he just doesn't, that's not the kind of writer he is. So, there is a lot of ambition, creative ambition and, formal ambition in what he does. I mean, one of the PlacePrints, the final one, Poison Cross, is actually told to us via a sat-nav device and a truck that the sat-nav is in conversation with each other. So, he pushes it, he definitely pushes it. And for us, we always want to do more than just give people an evening's entertainment or just tell them a good old story. We want to push further than that because we know the possibilities of the stage or of the live performances that we specialize in. We know the possibilities are wider than that. So, it's never quite enough for me to just tell a good old yarn.
But of course, during lockdown, you're not able to tell those stories in the normal way. So how has New Perspectives been affected by the lockdown?
We have certainly been affected, and we've cancelled 2 tours, not cancelled, but postponed 2 tours so far. But, at the moment, I don't see us as having been as drastically affected as many organisations, particularly theatre buildings, who have a huge reliance on box office or bar income, and also not as affected as the many, many freelance artists out there who are relying on exactly the kinds of art forms that we make for their living. So I feel that we're quite sort of privileged, really, in occupying that kind of middle space where we're not big enough to be completely destroyed and not small enough to have lost, our basic bread, as it were. So we're kind of in the middle, and so because of that, we feel it's very important to stay active and to continue employing people as much as we can and to do our bit in that respect. So we have, rather than kind of taking a big break, we have fashioned a kind of, a responsive program to what's happening that, we'll still employ people, and we'll still employ artists and actors and everything else. And similarly, we have a talent development program, which again was normally a face-to-face kind of training development year, but we're maintaining that as well. So far it's all happening online, but we're maintaining that because we don't want artists to take an even bigger knock than they already have to. So, we're just having to use the time in a creative and constructive way. I have no doubt that live theatre and live performance will come back into our society, definitely. I'm not, some people are really ringing the death knell of that, but I don't believe that. But it's a good call to all of us to think about, well, how else can we reach people? How else can we keep the country energized and inspired? And the dominant response to that throughout the industries has been to put stuff online, which we're doing a bit of, but we're also looking at other things we can do, particularly with the village communities that we work with. How can we engage village audiences, in ways that feel tactile and special, not just telling everyone to tune into their computer at a certain time of night. So we've got various things bubbling, some of which we're not supposed to talk about yet, but things that are working with different mediums, whether that's postal mediums, whether that's putting things in villages themselves. Just there are always ways of reaching people. And they don't take the place exactly of live theatre, but they're an extension of it. And, that's still valuable. So I think, a company like us has really had a kind of major existential rethink about, well, what are the various strands we can offer people, and what are our skills that we learn in making theatre that can be extended, whether that's writing, whether that's being able to build environments and sets or whatever. Yeah, so we're actually, although there are fears and there are concerns about the amount of loss and the effect on people, we're also weirdly quite galvanized by this time through necessity.
Jack McNamara, the Artistic Director of New Perspectives. PlacePrints is now available on all podcast platforms and on the company's website.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.